Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
My name is Maximilian Clark, and from the moment I learned I shared my name with an iconic explorer, I felt destined for greatness. The idea of ruling, of being at the top, was intoxicating. Of course, I understood early on that becoming an actual king wasn't realistic in this modern world. But the ambition to conquer, to dominate, never left me. I wanted to win, and not just win, I wanted to obliterate any competition. I strived to be the best at everything I touched for most of my life. I succeeded, whether it was in academics, sports, or my career. I thrived. I was relentless, methodical, and yes, ruthless when necessary. People admired me. They feared me. They knew I wouldn't settle for anything less than perfection. I was Maximilian Clark, the unstoppable force. But there was one place where my drive to win fell apart. A place where all my strategies and determination failed me: my marriage to Isabel. It didn't just end. It crashed and burned in a way that still stings. Let me explain in detail. I'm an accounts major and work for Westhaven Accounting Group. On the surface, it's as clean and respectable as you'd expect, a place of order, numbers, and balance sheets. But like most things in life, there's more beneath the surface. Our firm has its secrets, though nothing too scandalous, just one really, and it's more fascinating than sinister. The owner of our firm has a peculiar connection. He's a close friend of a Bolivian drug lord named Esteban. I can't recall Esteban's last name. It's unimportant really, but his name alone carries weight. Esteban's moniker is something of a contradiction. He's the Serpent of Mercy. Esteban's story is the stuff of movies. He was just an ordinary man going about his life like the rest of us until he discovered his lineage. A son of a notorious drug lord. That revelation changed everything in a dramatic twist worthy of any crime saga. Esteban returned home to claim his place. He didn't just slip into his father's world quietly. Oh no, he carved his path in blood. First, he wiped out his family's enemies, his uncle to be precise, then turned his attention to his own father. Took him out as well. And the prodigal son returned home, all right, but not for a tearful reunion. And when it was all over, Esteban was the new kingpin. Sounds cool now, right? Esteban's account, yes, the Serpent of Mercy himself, is handled by me. It's one of those things you don't exactly brag about at office parties but feels significant nonetheless. I've only had the privilege or misfortune, depending on how you look at it, of meeting the man in person once. Honestly, he seemed ordinary. Just a guy you'd pass on the street without a second glance. No aura of menace, no dramatic flair. If you didn't know his story, you'd think he was an accountant himself. His right-hand man, though, that's a different story. Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it. Every time you meet him, he has this bizarre habit of asking, "Do you like soup?" Out of sheer curiosity, and maybe a bit of pressure, I tried his special soup once. He insisted it was something extraordinary, something I wouldn't forget. I didn't taste anything remarkable, but the way he and his friend, a man with a sinister laugh, watched me eat was unnerving. They laughed afterward. A kind of knowing, mocking laughter that left me uneasy. I sat there, soup bowl empty, feeling like I was the punchline to some joke I didn't understand. In moments like those, I wished I had picked up some martial arts in school. If I had, I'd have taught them a lesson for good. Well, coming back to my story, I married Emily. Yes, it's always an Emily, isn't it? There's something about the name. I met her at a charity gala in Fairhaven, one of those dull networking events where everyone pretends to care about small talk. She walked in wearing a sapphire blue dress that made the room stop for a second, and just like that, I was smitten. She wasn't just beautiful. She had this aura, this magnetism that pulled you in. Emily was sharp, quick-witted, and had this way of laughing at my jokes that made me feel like I was the only man in the world. For someone like me, someone who had always seen life as a battlefield to conquer, she was my next challenge. Like Maximilian Clark eyeing a new territory, I wanted her, and when I want something, I don't stop until I have it. Winning Emily over wasn't easy, though. She wasn't the kind of woman you could charm with a few clever lines or a fancy dinner. She had standards, boundaries, and a knack for keeping me on my toes. But that only made the pursuit more thrilling. I worked for her affection like I'd worked for every other victory in my life, with persistence, strategy, and an unrelenting drive to succeed. When I finally broke through her walls, it was worth every ounce of effort. Emily was intoxicating, not just in the way she looked, but in the fire she carried within her. It matched my own, making everything between us electric. The intimacy between us was unparalleled. It wasn't just physical. It was like standing at the peak of a mountain victorious, basking in the glory of a hard-fought climb. After a year of unforgettable nights, laughter, and moments that felt like I was finally living my best life, I decided to make it official. I popped the question and she said yes. Emily worked at a prestigious law firm in Riverview as an office manager. Her boss was a man named Lucas Hawthorne. Lucas was the type of man who walked into a room and demanded attention without saying a word. His posture, his smirk, the way his eyes scanned people like chess pieces. It all screamed power. He was a conqueror, much like me. But there was one glaring difference. Lucas wanted everything. Not just success, not just power, everything. The first time I met him was at one of Emily's office gatherings. She had insisted I come along, saying it was important for her colleagues to meet me. I wasn't thrilled, but for her I went. The moment I walked in, I spotted him, holding court in the center of the room, a glass of aged bourbon in hand, laughing too loudly at his own jokes. He spotted me almost immediately, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. It was subtle, but I caught it. When Emily introduced us, I extended my hand with a polite smile. "Maximilian Clark," I said. "Emily's fiancé." "Lucas Hawthorne," he replied, gripping my hand just a fraction too tightly. "Emily's boss. Nice to finally meet the man she's always talking about." There was a challenge in his tone, and I matched it with one of my own. "I'd say the same about you, Lucas. Emily's told me all about you. Quite the empire you've built here." He chuckled, releasing my hand. "Empire? Hardly. Just a man who knows what he wants and goes after it." His gaze flicked briefly to Emily, then back to me. "Well, you've done a fine job," I said, my tone cool but sharp enough to let him know I'd caught that look. "But I find the best things in life aren't built. They're won." Our eyes locked for a second longer than necessary. It was a silent battle, a test of wills. By the end of that handshake, I knew I'd won that round. He knew it too, and I saw the hatred flicker in his eyes before he plastered on a polite smile. "Enjoy the party," he said, his tone dripping with fake civility. "Oh, with Emily by my side, I will," I replied, matching his fake smile with one of my own. From that moment, it was clear Lucas Hawthorne hated me, and I, in turn, had no love for the man. The second time I crossed paths with Lucas Hawthorne was at a house party. It wasn't my scene, but Emily had insisted, saying it would be good for us to mingle. Reluctantly, I agreed, though I already knew it would be another tedious evening of small talk and passive-aggressive jabs from Lucas. When we arrived, the party was in full swing, but the focus of the room wasn't on cocktails or conversations. Everyone was gathered around a massive flat-screen TV, watching UFC 302. My kind of entertainment, sure, but as I scanned the room, I noticed the energy was heavily skewed. The crowd, including Lucas, was buzzing with excitement, rooting for Eduardo Reyes. I never liked Reyes. Something about him just grated on me. Maybe it was his arrogance, or maybe it was the fact that everyone loved him. Either way, he wasn't my guy. But Jonathan Price? Not exactly my favorite either. Still, between the two, I'd back Price just to spite the crowd. Sometimes, it's not about liking someone, it's about standing against the masses. Lucas, of course, was in the center of it all, drink in hand, laughing loudly. As I stepped closer, he caught sight of me and smirked. "Clark," he said, lifting his glass slightly. "Glad you could make it. You're just in time to see Reyes put Price to sleep." I shrugged, leaning against the counter. "I wouldn't count on that. Price is scrappy. He might just knock Reyes out cold." The room quieted for a moment as Lucas turned to face me fully, his smirk widening into something more predatory. "Knock him out? Price against Eduardo Reyes." He let out a sharp laugh. "Clark, I know you like to take the contrarian stance, but that's just ridiculous. Reyes is going to walk all over him." I folded my arms, meeting his gaze evenly. "We'll see." He raised an eyebrow, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. With a flourish, he placed it on the coffee table in the center of the room. "Care to make it interesting?" he asked, his voice dripping with confidence. The room watched in silence, the tension crackling between us. I wasn't about to back down, not to him. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was pride. Without a word, I reached into my own wallet, pulled out a matching $50 bill, and placed it beside his. The atmosphere in the room was electric, everyone glued to the screen as the fight began. Emily was sitting with a group of people, and to my annoyance, she was cheering for Reyes. Her voice, usually sweet and soft, now carried a sharp enthusiasm every time Reyes landed a strike. I clenched my jaw. Sure, it was just a fight, but it felt like betrayal. Of all the people she could back, why him? Lucas, of course, was leading the cheers, barking out predictions and nodding smugly every time Reyes made a move. See that? Too easy for Eduardo, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. Price has got nothing. I stayed quiet, watching the screen intently. I didn't need to say anything. I just needed to wait. And then, 2 minutes and 45 seconds into the second round, it happened. Price landed a devastating right hook. The room fell into stunned silence as Reyes hit the canvas, followed by a barrage of strikes until the referee jumped in. The fight was over. Price had done it. I stood up, unable to hold back the grin spreading across my face. Hell yes, I shouted, my voice breaking the heavy quiet in the room. I turned to Lucas, who sat frozen, his smirk wiped clean off his face. Walking to the coffee table, I leaned down, picked up both bills, and held them up for everyone to see. Never underestimate the underdog, I said, my voice calm but cutting. The room stayed silent as I slipped the money into my pocket and turned to Lucas. His jaw was tight, and his eyes burned with barely concealed fury. I gave him a small nod, a victory salute, before walking back to Emily, who was now staring at me with a mixture of surprise and, was that pride? For once, Lucas had nothing to say, and that silence was sweeter than any words he could have thrown at me. I couldn't stop smiling on the way home that night. It was 2-0 now, me over Lucas. And when we got home, I made sure it was 2-0 with Emily as well, if you catch my drift. Life felt good. These little victories fueled me, gave me that rush of being on top. But looking back, I should have seen it for what it was. A calm before a storm I couldn't possibly imagine. 3 months later, Emily and I tied the knot in a beautiful ceremony overlooking the coastline of Oceanside. Lucas, of course, was there. He had to be. Emily had insisted, and like clockwork, he showed up with that infuriating smirk plastered on his face. When he came up to congratulate us, he clasped my hand firmly and leaned in closer than necessary. Congratulations, Clark, he said smoothly, his tone dripping with something I couldn't quite place. You've really outdone yourself. I met his gaze, refusing to flinch. Thanks, Lucas, I replied evenly, pulling my hand back. Means a lot coming from you. His smirk deepened, and for a split second, I thought I saw something darker flicker in his eyes. Resentment, maybe even hate. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for only me to hear. Enjoy it while it lasts. I didn't respond. There was no need to. I just watched him walk away, his presence leaving a chill in its wake. But I didn't let him get to me. Not that night. It was my wedding day and no one, not even Lucas Hawthorne, was going to ruin it. The honeymoon was everything I could have hoped for: sandy beaches, crystal clear water, and nights filled with laughter and passion. For a while, it felt like I had truly conquered the world. When we got back, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. My accounts were thriving, Emily seemed happy, and everything felt easy. But as they say, time doesn't stand still. It moves, shifts, and often takes things with it. Slowly but surely, the ease I had grown accustomed to started to slip through my fingers. The air around me began to feel heavy, as if some unseen force was gearing up to pull the rug out from under me. Little did I know, things were about to get worse. Far worse. 3 years into my marriage, I thought I had it all figured out. Life was routine, sure, but it was a comfortable kind of routine. Until that night, when Emily walked into the living room with a strange look on her face and said those 4 words that could make any man's stomach drop like a stone: Max, we need to talk. I had heard that line before, from friends, coworkers, even strangers at bars sharing tales of marital doom, and it was never good. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, sat back in my favorite armchair, and braced for whatever she was about to throw at me. All right, I said, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. Let's hear it. She took a deep breath and sat across from me, avoiding my eyes at first. Then she started. Max, she began, her voice shaky. My boss, Lucas, You know he's single, right? I nodded slowly, unsure where this was going, but already feeling the tension creep into my neck. Yeah, I know. What about it? Well, she continued, her words coming faster now. He's been talking to me about wanting to become a father. He's been there for me, Max. When I had no job, he was the one who hired me. He gave me a chance when no one else would. And, well, he's asked me to give him a child. I froze mid-sip, the glass halfway to my lips. I stared at her, trying to process what I had just heard. Come again. He wants me to have his baby? She repeated, her voice quieter now but steady. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Let me get this straight, I said, setting the glass down. He wants to hand over a little cup with his contribution. They'll pull your egg out, mix it in a lab somewhere, stick it in a surrogate, and we all sit around and wait for his kid to show up? Emily shook her head, biting her lip nervously. No, Max. He doesn't want to do it like that. He wants to do it the old-fashioned way, like a man and a woman. My stomach turned, and the anger that had been simmering in me started to boil over. I stood up so fast the chair nearly tipped over. No thanks, I said firmly, my voice louder than I intended. My wife is no baby factory. I took a deep breath, letting the initial shock of Emily's words sink in, then turned to her with as much composure as I could muster. My voice was firm and unyielding. The only baby you will ever have, I said, narrowing my eyes, will be mine. Do I make myself clear? Emily's lips quivered, and she tried to step closer to me. Max, please listen. No. I cut her off, raising a hand to silence her. If you have any more questions or thoughts on this ridiculous topic, let me save us both some time. This conversation is over. Her expression shifted instantly, her face hardening as her voice turned cold. He was right about you, she said, almost spitting the words. You're selfish. All you care about is your ego, not what I want. You'll regret this, Max. Mark my words. Without waiting for a response, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, the sound of the door reverberating through the quiet house. My pride, what little of it remained after such a humiliating confrontation, kept me rooted in place. I told myself she needed time to cool off, that she would see reason and come back on her own. I wasn't about to chase after her, not this time. Later that evening, I was sitting in my gaming recliner, completely immersed in God of War. The world around me faded as I slayed monsters and explored Norse mythology. Then, without warning, something slammed into the back of my head. My vision blurred, and everything went black. I didn't even have time to register what was happening before I was unconscious. When I finally regained some sense of awareness, my head throbbed, and I could barely focus. My body was stiff, my wrists aching. I tried to move but found myself restrained. I looked around, only to realize that I was tied up. The cold, familiar surroundings of my living room did nothing to comfort me. The furniture was in place, but the atmosphere felt entirely different. Heavy, suffocating. What the hell happened? How did I get here? My mind raced, struggling to piece together the fragmented moments leading up to this, but there were no answers, only the eerie silence surrounding me. Then I heard footsteps. Emily walked into the room, and behind her Lucas followed. Both of them smiled at me. Emily came near, kissed me on the lips, and then walked back to Lucas. They began kissing, their actions deliberate and cruel. I clenched my fists, rage boiling inside me. Then Lucas turned to me, his smirk filled with malice. You're just a weak man, he sneered. Ordinary. Nothing special. You think you're something? You're nothing, Maximilian. I willed myself to stay calm, to not give him the satisfaction of seeing me crack. But he wasn't done. When Emily's carrying my child, you'll be nothing more than a servant. You'll take care of her during the pregnancy, do everything she needs, and when the kid is born, I'll take it from you. It'll be mine, not yours. You'll hand it over without question. Every word he spoke was like a dagger, daring me to react. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I knew it wouldn't help. Lucas always had a way of making himself the bigger man, of getting under your skin. You're going to be a good boy, Maximilian, he taunted. Make sure Emily's comfortable. Make sure everything's perfect for her while she carries my child. You'll do it because you have no choice. You'll do as I say, just like the weak little man you are. My jaw tightened, but I couldn't let him see how much he was getting to me. I had to stay focused. You think I'm just going to roll over for you? I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. You think you can just come in here and dictate everything? Lucas smirked. Of course. You'll do whatever it takes to make sure Emily's happy. Won't you? You'll be the perfect little husband, taking care of her while I'm off making my mark. You won't stand in my way, because you know you can't. His words hit harder than anything physical. I clenched my fists, my mind racing, searching for a way to turn the tables. The humiliation and anger churned inside me, but I forced myself to stay quiet. Lucas had made his move, and for now I had to bide my time. When Emily returned from the kitchen with a glass of wine in hand, she glanced at me briefly before sitting beside Lucas, as though I were nothing more than an insignificant bystander in my own home. I'll be filing for divorce, I muttered coldly, my voice barely above a whisper. Both of them turned to look at me. Emily's eyes widened in shock, while Lucas's smirk deepened into something more sinister. You think you can just walk away from this? Lucas said, his tone mocking. You're in this, Maximilian, whether you like it or not. You're trapped. I'm not trapped. I shot back, my voice steady now. And I'm not playing your games anymore. Lucas leaned forward, his expression darkening. Oh, but you will. You'll come crawling back because you'll have no choice. And when you do, I'll make sure you understand your place. I met his gaze without flinching. Enjoy your moment, Lucas. It won't last. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Emily, however, looked uneasy. For a brief moment, I thought I saw regret flicker in her eyes, but she quickly masked it, turning her attention back to Lucas. That night, I packed a bag and left the house. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring past as my mind raced. Every memory of Emily, every moment we had shared, now felt tainted. By the time the sun began to rise, I found myself parked outside my office. It was the only place that felt remotely like a refuge. The security guard on duty noticed the blood on my face and immediately rushed to help. Should I call 911? He asked, his voice tight with concern. No, I said firmly. Just call Mason. Mason was my closest ally at the firm. Within minutes, he arrived, his usual calm demeanor replaced by urgency. He ushered me into a private meeting room, his sharp eyes scanning me for answers. I told him everything, Lucas's threats, Emily's betrayal, and the humiliation I had endured. Mason listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stood, his voice calm but firm. You need to be careful. Max Lucas isn't just some arrogant prick. He's dangerous. What do you mean? I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. Mason leaned against the table, his gaze steady. Lucas has connections, dangerous ones. He's tied to a Colombian cartel, the Santoro family. While Lucas plays the corporate game here, his brother, Santiago, runs their operations back in Medellin. These aren't people you can go head-to-head with lightly. The weight of Mason's words hit me like a freight train. Lucas wasn't just a rival. He was part of a criminal empire far beyond anything I could have imagined. The revelation about Lucas's connections to the Santoro cartel left me reeling. My rivalry with him had just escalated into dangerous territory, one where every move could have life or death consequences. But I couldn't let that stop me. Lucas had crossed a line, and I was determined to make him pay. Mason, I said, my voice firm despite the turmoil inside me. I don't care who Lucas is connected to. He came into my home, humiliated me, and thinks he can take everything I care about. I won't let that stand. Mason studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. If you're serious about this, you'll need to be smart. You can't go at Lucas head-on. You'll need to outthink him. Then help me? I said, desperation edging my tone. You know how to handle situations like this. What do I do? Mason leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. We'll need leverage, something Lucas can't ignore. He's cocky, sure, but he's careful. We have to find a way to lure him into a trap. A trap? I repeated, intrigued. Yes, Mason said, his tone steady. Lucas will think he's untouchable, but everyone has weaknesses. We just need to find his and use it against him. The idea was dangerous, but it lit a spark of hope in me. Mason was right, Lucas wasn't invincible. And if I could outmaneuver him, I could take back control of my life. The plan started with surveillance. Mason had a network of contacts who could dig into Lucas's activities, and within days we had a clearer picture of his operations. He wasn't just a cartel puppet. He was actively involved in laundering money through his corporate ventures. His arrogance had made him sloppy, leaving behind breadcrumbs that Mason's team eagerly followed. One of the biggest pieces of the puzzle was Lucas's overconfidence in his relationship with Emily. He seemed to believe he had already won, which made him careless. Mason suggested using this to our advantage. "We'll set a meeting," Mason said one evening as we pored over the gathered intel. "Lucas will think it's a business opportunity or some kind of negotiation, but in reality it'll be a chance to corner him." "And what happens when he's cornered?" I asked, unsure of where Mason was going with this. "That's when we bring in someone who can deal with people like Lucas," Mason replied cryptically. "Leave that part to me." I wasn't entirely comfortable with the vagueness of Mason's plan, but I trusted him. He had a way of handling situations that always seemed to work out. I just had to follow his lead. The night of the confrontation arrived faster than I expected. We had set up the meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a neutral location where we could control the environment. Mason's team had prepared everything: hidden cameras, soundproofing, and multiple escape routes in case things went south. When Lucas arrived, he walked in with his usual swagger, completely unaware of what was waiting for him. Emily was at his side, her expression cold and unreadable. She barely acknowledged me as they approached the table in the center of the room. "Well, this is dramatic," Lucas said, his smirk firmly in place. "What's the occasion, Clark? You finally come to surrender." I met his gaze, forcing myself to stay calm. "I wanted to talk, man to man." Lucas raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Talk? About what?" "About boundaries," I said evenly. "And consequences." Lucas laughed, the sound echoing through the empty space. "Consequences? For you, maybe. You're out of your league here, Clark." Before I could respond, the doors at the back of the warehouse opened, and two men walked in. One of them was Mason, his face set in a grim expression. The other was a man I didn't recognize, a towering figure with an air of authority that made even Lucas falter for a moment. "This," Mason said, motioning to the stranger, "is Rafael Morales. He's with the Santoro family, the people you've been crossing. He has a few things to say." Lucas's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of unease. "What is this, Clark?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You think you can threaten me?" "I don't have to," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Rafael here seems to think you've been overstepping your bounds. He's not happy about it." Rafael stepped forward, his gaze cold and unyielding. "You've been sloppy, Lucas," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And that reflects poorly on all of us. It's time to clean up your mess." Lucas's face drained of color as he realized the gravity of the situation. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Lucas stammered, his confident facade crumbling under Rafael's icy glare. I've done nothing to compromise the family," he insisted, his voice faltering. "This is a setup." Rafael didn't flinch. His expression remained cold and calculating. "Your arrogance has blinded you, Lucas. Sloppy laundering, unnecessary attention, actions that risk exposing the entire network. You've been warned before and now you've dragged this." He glanced at me briefly. "Outsider into your mess. This ends tonight." Lucas's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but the warehouse was tightly controlled. Mason's men were stationed at every exit, their faces stern and weapons visible. He was cornered. "You can't do this," Lucas barked, regaining some of his bluster. "I've been loyal, more loyal than any of you. This is Clark's doing. He's trying to undermine me." Rafael took a slow step closer, his presence suffocating. "Blaming others won't save you, Lucas. Your actions speak louder than your excuses. And as for Clark, he's irrelevant to this. You brought this on yourself." Emily, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but laced with fear. "Lucas, stop. They're serious. Please, just fix this." Lucas shot her a venomous look. "Fix this? Do you think I can just snap my fingers and make this go away? This is your fault too, Emily. You've been playing both sides." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't respond. She simply lowered her head, avoiding everyone's gaze. Raphael signaled to one of his men, who stepped forward and placed a briefcase on the table. He opened it, revealing a stack of documents and several USB drives. These are records of your activities, Lucas. Every mistake, every risk you've taken, documented. The family has decided it's time for you to step down. Lucas's jaw dropped. Step down? You can't. Raphael cut him off with a sharp gesture. This is not a negotiation. You'll transfer all your assets and relinquish your position. If you resist, you'll face consequences far worse than losing your title. The weight of Raphael's words hung in the air, crushing any hope Lucas might have had of salvaging the situation. He slumped into his chair, his bravado shattered. Fine, he muttered through gritted teeth. I'll sign whatever you want. As Raphael's men prepared the paperwork, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. Lucas, the man who had tried to destroy me, was finally being brought to his knees. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Lucas wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. When the documents were signed, Raphael turned to me. Your involvement ends here, he said, his tone final. You're lucky this didn't escalate further. Stay out of the family's affairs, or next time, you won't be so fortunate. I nodded, understanding the thinly veiled threat. Raphael and his men escorted Lucas out of the warehouse, leaving Emily and me alone with Mason. The silence was deafening. Emily broke it first. Max, I didn't know it would go this far. I never wanted this. I turned to her, my expression cold. You made your choices, Emily, and now you have to live with them. Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't care. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Without another word, I left the warehouse. Mason followed me outside, his hand resting on my shoulder. You did well tonight, he said. Lucas is out of the picture, and you've got your life back. I glanced at him, my jaw tight. Have I, though? This doesn't feel like a victory. It never does, Mason replied quietly. But sometimes, surviving is enough. The drive back to my temporary apartment was silent. Mason's words echoed in my mind, but they didn't bring me any comfort. Surviving wasn't enough, not after everything I had endured. Lucas might have been removed from the equation, but the scars he left behind were deep and unrelenting. When I reached my apartment, I sat in the dark, staring at nothing. The events of the night replayed in my head, each moment sharpening the ache in my chest. Emily's betrayal, Lucas's arrogance, Raphael's chilling presence. It was all too much. I had thought that taking Lucas down would bring closure, but instead, it left a void. A hollow space where my sense of victory should have been. The next morning, Mason called. How are you holding up? He asked, his voice more gentle than usual. Fine, I lied. What's the next step? There's no next step, Max, he replied firmly. This is over. You've won. Won, I repeated bitterly. What exactly did I win, Mason? My wife is gone. My life is in ruins, and I'm tangled up with a cartel I wanted no part of. Mason sighed. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you're free of Lucas. That's a start. Focus on rebuilding your life. Rebuilding. The word felt foreign, almost laughable. But Mason was right. I couldn't stay stuck in this cycle of anger and despair. If I wanted to move forward, I had to start somewhere. Over the next few weeks, I began the painstaking process of piecing my life back together. I finalized my divorce from Emily, severing the last ties that bound us. I moved out of my temporary apartment and found a modest place on the outskirts of the city. A quiet neighborhood where no one knew my name. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into my accounts, taking on more clients and responsibilities than ever before. The long hours kept my mind occupied, leaving little room for the memories that haunted me. But the peace didn't last. One evening, as I was locking up my office, a familiar voice stopped me in my tracks. Max. I turned to see Emily standing there, her expression a mix of regret and desperation. She looked different, worn, like the weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. What do you want, Emily? I asked, my voice cold and detached. I need your help, she said, her voice trembling. Lucas, he's not gone. He's still trying to control me. I narrowed my eyes. I thought Raphael took care of him. He did, she replied quickly. But Lucas is working in the shadows now. He's not giving up, Max. He's threatening me, saying he'll ruin me if I don't go back to him. I studied her for a moment, trying to decide if I could believe her. She had lied to me before, manipulated me. But there was something in her eyes this time, something raw and real. Why come to me? I asked. You made it clear where your loyalty lies. Because you're the only one who knows what he's capable of, she said, tears streaming down her face. Please, Max, I'm begging you. I looked away, torn between my lingering anger and the faint flicker of the man I used to be, the one who had loved her enough to fight for her. This isn't my problem anymore, Emily, I said finally. You made your choice. Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded, defeated. I understand, she whispered. But if he comes after you, be careful. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. If Lucas was still a threat, I couldn't ignore it. Not for Emily's sake, but for my own. The thought of him lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next move, was unbearable. I needed to end this once and for all. I didn't sleep that night. Emily's words replayed in my mind, mingling with the memories of Lucas's taunts and Raphael's warnings. If Lucas was truly operating in the shadows, it meant the danger wasn't just theoretical. He was calculating his next move, and I needed to calculate mine. The following morning, I called Mason. He answered on the second ring. Max, he said, his tone cautious. What's going on? I need your help, I replied. Lucas is still active. He's threatening Emily. Mason sighed heavily. I told you to stay out of this. Raphael made it clear that your involvement was over. I'm not doing this for Emily, I said firmly. Lucas is a threat, and if he's left unchecked, he'll come after me too. We need to shut him down for good. There was a long pause before Mason spoke again. Fine, he said reluctantly. But this time, we do it on our terms. Over the next few days, Mason and I worked to track Lucas's activities. His arrogance had been replaced with a newfound caution, but he wasn't invisible. Mason's network unearthed a series of suspicious transactions linked to a shell company Lucas was using to funnel money. It was a weak spot, a crack in his armor, and we planned to exploit it. The shell company was tied to a high-end private club in downtown Westport. It was the kind of place where deals were made behind closed doors, away from prying eyes. Mason and I decided to infiltrate it, posing as potential investors. It was risky, but it was our best shot at gathering the evidence we needed to expose Lucas and sever his influence for good. The night of the operation, I dressed in a tailored suit, my nerves hidden beneath a mask of confidence. Mason met me outside the club, his expression unreadable as always. You ready for this? He asked. As ready as I'll ever be, I replied. Inside, the atmosphere was exactly as I'd expected. Dim lighting, expensive decor, and an air of exclusivity that bordered on suffocating. Lucas was there, seated at a private table in the corner, surrounded by a few men who looked more like enforcers than business partners. He hadn't noticed us yet, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. Mason and I made our way to the bar, blending into the crowd as we waited for the right moment to strike. Mason handed me a small earpiece, his voice calm and steady in my ear. Stay close, follow my lead, and don't engage unless necessary. I nodded, my heart pounding as the plan unfolded. Mason approached one of Lucas's associates, striking up a conversation about a fictional business deal. The man took the bait, leading Mason into a side room where the real negotiations would take place. Meanwhile, I moved toward Lucas, staying just out of his line of sight. The moment of confrontation came faster than I expected. Lucas glanced up, his eyes locking onto mine. His smirk returned, though it was tinged with something darker, something desperate. Clark, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Couldn't stay away, could you? Just enjoying the view, I replied, keeping my tone casual. You seem awfully comfortable for someone who's lost everything. Lucas's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. Lost everything? Hardly. I'm just getting started. Before I could respond, Mason's voice crackled in my ear. We've got what we need. Time to go. I didn't hesitate. I turned and walked away, ignoring Lucas's taunts as I made my way to the exit. Mason met me outside, his face lit with a rare smile. We've got him, he said, holding up a flash drive. This has everything: money laundering, fraudulent contracts, even links to the Santoro cartel. He's finished. The fallout was swift and merciless. Mason's team leaked the evidence to the authorities and the media, ensuring that Lucas's crimes couldn't be buried. Within days, his assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed, and warrants issued for his arrest. The Santoro cartel, furious at Lucas's recklessness, disavowed him entirely. He had nowhere to run. I thought I would feel relief, maybe even triumph, but instead, I felt empty. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind were permanent. Months later, I found myself in a quiet cafe, sipping coffee and watching the world go by. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. My work was steady, my new home peaceful, and Lucas was nothing more than a memory. Emily had disappeared from my life completely, leaving no trace. Mason joined me at the table, his expression lighter than usual. "How's the new chapter treating you?" he asked. "It's quiet," I said, a faint smile tugging at my lips. "And that's enough." Mason nodded, raising his cup in a silent toast. "To surviving." "To surviving," I echoed, clinking my cup against his. And for the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself to breathe. Weeks passed, and life settled into its quiet rhythm. The storm that was Lucas Hawthorne had finally dissipated, leaving behind a stillness I hadn't experienced in years. Yet, in the quiet moments, I often caught myself wondering, was this truly the end? People like Lucas didn't just disappear. Even with his empire dismantled and his connections severed, he wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat. That thought lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. One evening, as I was going over accounts in my home office, there was a knock at the door. It was sharp, deliberate, too formal to be a neighbor. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. Grabbing the knife I kept in my desk drawer, I approached the door cautiously. When I opened it, a woman stood there. She was tall, impeccably dressed, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to see straight through me. Her presence was commanding, almost unnervingly so. "Maximilian Clark?" she asked, her tone professional yet cold. "Yes," I replied warily. "Who's asking?" She handed me a card. It bore a simple logo, a silver circle with the initials ICD embossed in the center. Beneath it was the name Victoria Hartman and the title Regional Director. "I'm here on behalf of an organization you've inadvertently entangled yourself with," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Excuse me," I said, bristling at her audacity. She turned to face me, her gaze unyielding. "You've crossed paths with individuals connected to the Santoro cartel, Maximilian. Our organization monitors such activity closely, and your involvement, whether intentional or not, has raised certain flags. Who are you people?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the knife behind my back. "Let's just say we're in the business of maintaining order," she replied cryptically. "Lucas Hawthorne was a problem, a rogue element. Thanks to your efforts, he's been neutralized. But the fallout from his downfall has created a vacuum, one that others are eager to fill. That's where we come in." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "And what does that have to do with me?" Victoria stepped closer, her expression softening slightly. "You've shown resourcefulness, courage, and an ability to adapt under pressure. Qualities we find valuable. I'm here to offer you an opportunity." "An opportunity?" I asked, my skepticism clear. "Yes," she said, "to work with us, to ensure that the power struggles you've been caught in don't spiral out of control. It's not a job offer, Maximilian. It's a lifeline, because whether you like it or not, you're already part of this world. And walking away isn't an option." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I looked at the card again, my mind racing. This wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself, but after everything I had been through, maybe it was the only path left. "What if I say no?" I asked, meeting her gaze. Victoria's lips curved into a faint, almost pitying smile. "Then you'd better hope you're very good at hiding, because sooner or later someone will come looking for you, and they won't be as polite as I am." For the next few days, I wrestled with the decision. Accepting Victoria's offer meant stepping deeper into a world I had fought so hard to escape. But refusing meant living the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next storm to hit. Finally, I made my choice. I called the number on the card, my hand trembling as I pressed the buttons. Victoria answered on the first ring. "I'm in," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Good," she replied. "Welcome to the initiative." From that day forward, my life changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. I became a part of something larger than myself, a covert network dedicated to maintaining balance in a world of chaos. The work was dangerous, often morally ambiguous, but it gave me purpose. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control, even as I navigated the shadows of a world I barely understood. The past was behind me, but its lessons stayed. Lucas, Emily, Mason, they were all chapters in a story that had shaped me into the man I had become. And while I couldn't predict what the future held, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't running anymore. The first few weeks with the initiative were grueling. Victoria wasn't exaggerating when she said this world was dangerous. Training was intense, both physically and mentally. They taught me how to fight, how to blend into a crowd, how to spot a threat before it became a problem. My accounting skills, surprisingly, became one of my greatest assets. The initiative relied heavily on tracking money trails, and my experience gave me a unique edge. Victoria oversaw my induction personally. She was as ruthless as she was meticulous, pushing me to my limits but never beyond them. "We don't just train you to survive, Maximilian," she told me during a sparring session. "We train you to dominate. If you're not ahead, you're already dead." As the weeks turned into months, I began taking on assignments. My first few missions were straightforward: tracking illicit funds, identifying key players in emerging criminal networks, and relaying intel to the team. But as I proved myself, the tasks became more complex and more personal. One night, I was summoned to Victoria's office. She gestured for me to sit as she slid a file across the desk. "Your next mission," she said, her voice as sharp as ever. "It's going to test you." I opened the file, my stomach tightening as I saw the name on the first page: Lucas Hawthorne. "He's resurfaced," Victoria said, watching my reaction carefully. "Apparently, he's managed to rebuild a fraction of his former operation. Sloppy, disorganized, but it's growing. He's desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." I stared at the file, my mind racing. "What's the objective?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Neutralize him," Victoria replied bluntly. "This time, permanently. He's become a liability, and we can't afford to let him regroup." I closed the file and looked up at her. "Why me?" Victoria leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Because you know him. You've faced him before, and you have more reason than anyone to see this through. Consider it closure." The mission took me to the outskirts of a small city in Eastern Europe, where Lucas had been spotted operating out of an abandoned factory. The facility was heavily guarded, a clear sign that he was expecting trouble. I spent days observing from a distance, mapping out the guards' patrols and identifying weak points in their defenses. On the fourth night, I made my move. Under the cover of darkness, I infiltrated the facility, my heart pounding as I navigated the maze of corridors. The guards were well armed but poorly trained, and I dispatched them with relative ease. By the time I reached Lucas's office, the adrenaline had taken over. He was there, sitting at a makeshift desk, a pistol within arm's reach. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment we simply stared at each other. He was thinner than I remembered, his once confident demeanor replaced by a wary edge. "Well," he said, forcing a smirk, "if it isn't Maximilian Clark. Come to finish what you started." "You brought this on yourself," I said, my voice cold. "You should have stayed gone." Lucas laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Stayed gone? Do you think I had a choice? People like me don't get to walk away, Clark. And neither do people like you." For a moment, his words hung in the air, cutting deeper than I expected. But I couldn't let him distract me. I raised my weapon, aiming it squarely at his chest. "This ends now." Lucas's smirk faded, replaced by something that almost looked like fear. "You think killing me changes anything?" he said, his voice trembling. "The world doesn't work like that. You'll just be cleaning up someone else's mess tomorrow." "Maybe," I said, "but you won't be part of it." And then I pulled the trigger. The flight back was quiet. I stared out the window, the weight of what I'd done settling over me. Lucas's words echoed in my mind, a reminder that the battle was far from over. But for now, at least one chapter of my life had been closed. When I returned to headquarters, Victoria was waiting. She didn't say anything, just handed me a glass of scotch and raised hers in a silent toast. I took a sip, the burn grounding me in the moment. "You did well," she said finally. "This isn't an easy life, Maximilian, but you've proven you can handle it." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The path I was on was one I never could have imagined, but it was mine now. And as much as I hated to admit it, I felt alive. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a purpose. The days after Lucas's elimination were quiet but tense. The initiative moved efficiently to dismantle the remnants of his network, ensuring there was no one left to pick up the pieces. My role was officially done, but the experience lingered, and with it came questions I couldn't shake. Lucas's final words, about the inevitability of the world's chaos, echoed in my mind, challenging the fragile sense of closure I had hoped for. Victoria must have noticed the shift in me. A week after my return, she summoned me to her office. Her demeanor was unusually relaxed, but her eyes held their usual sharpness. "Maximilian," she began, leaning back in her chair, "you've proven yourself time and again, but I can see the weight of this work is starting to press on you." I didn't respond immediately, unsure of where this was going. Finally, I said, "I keep wondering if it ever really ends. We stop one threat and another takes its place." Lucas was right about that. Victoria nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. He wasn't wrong. The world doesn't stop turning because we remove one cog from the machine. But that's not the point. Then what is? I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "The point," she said, her tone firm, "is that we fight to maintain balance. It's not about eradicating chaos. It's about keeping it in check. If we don't, the scales tip too far and the consequences are catastrophic." I let her words sink in, but they didn't quell the unease inside me. "And what happens when the fight consumes us?" I asked quietly. Victoria's expression softened, a rare vulnerability breaking through her usual stoicism. "Then you step back, you reevaluate, and you decide whether you want to keep going or walk away. The initiative doesn't hold anyone here against their will, Max. If you feel you've had enough, say the word." Her offer surprised me. For all her ruthlessness, Victoria had a way of reminding me that I wasn't just a pawn in this game. But I wasn't ready to make that decision. Not yet. The next few months passed in a blur of missions and briefings. Each operation felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, though the full picture remained elusive. I found myself drawn deeper into the world of the initiative, forging alliances with operatives from across the globe. The work was dangerous and often grueling, but it kept me focused, giving me little time to dwell on the past. One mission, however, broke through the routine. I was tasked with investigating a financial trail linked to a series of high-profile assassinations in Eastern Europe. The job seemed straightforward: track the money, identify the players, and report back. But as I delved deeper, I uncovered a name I hadn't expected: Emily Clark. My breath caught as I stared at the screen. Emily was listed as a consultant for a front company funneling money to the assassination's mastermind. It didn't make sense. She had disappeared after Lucas's fall. Why would she resurface now, and in this way? I took the information to Victoria, who studied it with her usual calm. "This complicates things," she said finally. "If Emily is involved, it's either by choice or coercion. Either way, we need to find out." "I'll handle it," I said quickly, the words escaping before I could think them through. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's wise? Your history with her could compromise your judgment." "I need to do this," I insisted. "I can stay objective." She considered me for a long moment before nodding. "Very well, but you're not going in alone." The mission led me to Prague, where Emily had been seen meeting with a known fixer. Mason accompanied me, his steady presence a comfort in the chaos. We staked out the meeting point, a high-end restaurant tucked away in the city's labyrinthine streets. When Emily finally appeared, my heart twisted. She looked different, older, harder, but still unmistakably her. As she sat across from the fixer, I couldn't tell if she was nervous or simply resigned. I watched through binoculars, every instinct screaming at me to act, but I held back, waiting for Mason's signal. When the fixer handed her a briefcase, Mason murmured, "That's our moment." We moved quickly, intercepting Emily as she left the restaurant. She froze when she saw me, her eyes wide with shock. "Max?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We need to talk, I said firmly, gesturing for her to follow us. Back at our safe house, Emily sat across from me, her hands trembling. I didn't expect to see you again, she said, her voice shaky. Why are you involved in this? I demanded, holding up the briefcase. What are you doing, Emily? She looked away, her shoulders slumping. I didn't have a choice, she said finally. After Lucas, I needed protection. The people I turned to dragged you into this mess. I finished for her. Do you know what you've gotten yourself into? I know, she said, her voice breaking. But I didn't see another way. Her vulnerability was genuine, but I couldn't let it cloud my judgment. You're coming with us, I said. We'll figure this out, but you're not staying here. Emily nodded, her resignation clear. Whatever she had gotten herself into, it was now tied to me once again. And for better or worse, I wasn't going to let her face it alone. The journey back from Prague was tense and silent. Emily sat between Mason and me in the back of the black SUV, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She avoided eye contact, staring out the window as the city's lights blurred into the darkness of the countryside. I couldn't tell if she was scared, ashamed, or both, but I wasn't ready to ask. Not yet. When we reached the safe house, Mason locked the briefcase in a secure vault before joining us in the living room. Emily perched on the edge of the couch, looking like a cornered animal. I sat across from her, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of everything. Start talking, I said, breaking the silence. My voice was firm but not harsh. Who dragged you into this, Emily? She hesitated, her gaze flickering between Mason and me. Finally, she sighed, the weight of her choices evident in her expression. After Lucas, everything fell apart. I had no money, no job, no one to turn to. Then someone approached me, offered me protection, resources, a way out. Who? Mason interjected, his tone sharper than mine. A man named Victor Kazin, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's connected to the people Lucas was working with. At first, I thought it was just a business arrangement. But then what? I pressed. Then I realized I was in over my head, she admitted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. They used me as a front to move money, cover their tracks. I didn't think I had a choice. You always have a choice, I snapped, my frustration boiling over. But instead, you let yourself become a pawn in their game. Emily flinched, but Mason raised a hand to calm me. Max, he said evenly, focus. We need facts, not accusations. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. What's in the briefcase? I asked, my tone softer now. Emily shook her head. I don't know. Victor gave it to me and told me to deliver it to someone in Vienna. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. Mason exchanged a glance with me. We'll open it, he said. But first, we need to decide what to do with her. I'm sitting right here, Emily said, her voice laced with defiance. And I'm not a criminal. I didn't want any of this. No, I replied coldly. But you still brought it to our doorstep. Later that night, Mason and I examined the contents of the briefcase. Inside, we found a mix of cash, forged documents, and a flash drive. The drive contained encrypted files, which Mason's tech team began decoding immediately. The initial analysis revealed payment ledgers tied to a series of high-profile assassinations across Europe, names, dates, and amounts that painted a chilling picture. Victor's more than just a middleman, Mason said grimly. He's orchestrating hits and using Emily as a shield. I clenched my fists, anger surging through me. So what do we do? Mason leaned back, his expression calculating. We take this to Victoria. She'll know how to handle it. But Emily stays under our watch until this is over. And Victor? I asked. He's a loose end, Mason replied. And loose ends don't last long in our line of work. The next morning, Victoria arrived at the safe house. She reviewed the evidence with her usual composure, her sharp mind already formulating a plan. This Victor Kazin is a problem, she said finally. He's dangerous, but he's also vulnerable. We use Emily to lure him out. No, I said immediately, surprising even myself. She's done enough. We're not putting her in more danger. Victoria arched an eyebrow. Your personal feelings are irrelevant, Max. If we want to neutralize Victor, we need leverage, and Emily is it. Emily, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If it helps end this, I'll do whatever you need." I turned to her, my expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "You don't owe them anything, Emily. I owe myself," she replied. "I got into this mess, and if this is my chance to fix it, I'm taking it." Victoria smiled faintly, clearly impressed. "Good. Then let's get started." The plan was simple but dangerous. Emily would arrange a meeting with Victor under the pretense of delivering another payment. Mason and I would be close by, ready to move in once Victor revealed himself. It was a high-stakes gamble, but it was the best shot we had. On the day of the operation, Emily walked into the meeting location, a luxury hotel in Vienna, with a calmness I didn't think she possessed. I watched her from a distance, every muscle in my body tense. Victor arrived shortly after, his imposing frame and cold demeanor radiating authority. As he sat across from Emily, their conversation began, but I couldn't hear the words. "Stay ready," Mason whispered in my ear. "We'll move on my signal." Minutes felt like hours as we waited for the right moment. Then Victor leaned forward, his expression darkening as he handed Emily another briefcase. Mason gave the signal and we moved in, guns drawn. "Victor Kazan," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "This ends now." Victor turned toward me, his cold blue eyes narrowing as a slow, sinister smile spread across his face. He didn't flinch, didn't panic. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of control that sent a chill down my spine. "You've been a thorn in many sides, Mr. Clark," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "But do you really think you can end this? You don't understand the game you're playing." "I understand enough," I replied, my weapon trained on him. "It's over, Victor. You've got nowhere to run." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you're the hero in the story? You're just another piece on the board, like everyone else. Remove me and another will take my place. That's how this world works." "You're right," I said, taking a step closer. "But that's not my problem anymore. My goal isn't to fix the world. It's to stop you." Before he could respond, Mason and Victoria's operatives burst into the room, weapons drawn. Victor's guards made a move, but they were quickly subdued. The balance of power shifted in an instant, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in Victor's eyes. Victoria stepped forward, her expression as sharp as a blade. "Victor Kazan, you've been a liability for far too long. Your empire ends today." Victor's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked his fear with bravado. "You think killing me will change anything? You'll create a vacuum, and chaos will fill it." Victoria didn't flinch. "Perhaps, but at least you won't be around to enjoy it." She gave a subtle nod, and one of her operatives placed a pair of cuffs on Victor, securing him for extraction. He didn't resist, though his eyes burned with hatred as they led him away. As the dust settled, I turned to Emily, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She looked at me, her eyes filled with gratitude, and something else I couldn't quite place. "It's over," I said, my voice quieter now. "You're free." Emily nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you, Max, for everything." I wanted to say something more, to acknowledge the tangled mess of emotions between us, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I simply nodded and turned away. There was nothing left to say. Back at headquarters, Victoria debriefed me in her office. "You handled yourself well," she said, her tone uncharacteristically approving. "Victor's capture will send a message, but you should know this: there will always be another Victor." "I know," I replied, "but for now it's enough." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Take some time to rest, Maximilian. You've earned it." The next morning, I found myself sitting on a bench in a quiet park, the early sunlight warming my face. The world felt oddly still, as if the chaos of the past few months had finally given way to peace. I thought about everything: Lucas, Emily, Victor, the initiative. It had been a long, harrowing journey, but it had shaped me into someone I barely recognized. Stronger, wiser, but also more aware of the fragility of the world I had tried so hard to control. Emily had chosen to disappear, this time for good. Mason assured me she'd be safe, that the initiative would ensure she got a fresh start far from the shadows that had consumed her. I hoped she found the peace she was searching for, just as I was trying to find my own. As I sat there, a breeze rustling the leaves above, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The battle wasn't over, it never would be, but I had found my place in it. I wasn't a hero, a victim, or a pawn. I was simply a man doing what he could to keep the scales from tipping too far. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to smile.